The moment you stop explaining yourself, something shifts inside her. Not because you became distant, not because you played a game, but because for the first time she felt your presence without being pulled into your reasoning. Most men never notice this moment. They talk right past it. They explain right through it. And by the time they realize something changed, the attraction is already quieter than before. In a moment, you'll understand why. You see, over-explaining feels like clarity to the man doing it. It feels respectful, considerate, safe. You're trying to make sure she understands your intentions, your thoughts, your logic, but attraction doesn't live in logic, it lives in emotional space. And when you over-explain, you don't create space. You fill it. Think about the last time you felt drawn to someone, really drawn. Not because they convinced you, not because they justified themselves perfectly, but because there was something calm and grounded about the way they existed. They didn't rush to clarify every pause. They didn't scramble to explain every silence. They trusted that their presence alone was enough. That trust is what women feel. Here's the uncomfortable truth most men never hear. When you explain too much, you're not communicating, you're negotiating your value. And negotiation kills polarity. A woman doesn't feel drawn to a man because he makes sense. She feels drawn because she feels safe inside the emotional atmosphere he creates. Because his energy doesn't wobble every time there's uncertainty. Over-explaining often comes from a subtle place of fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being judged, fear of losing her interest. And women are incredibly sensitive to that fear even when they can't name it. They feel it as tension, as a slight loss of attraction, as a sense that the man in front of them is trying to manage the interaction instead of inhabiting it. Let me paint a familiar scene. You send a message. She replies hours later. You feel that little drop in your chest, so you respond with extra detail, extra warmth, extra explanation. You explain why you were busy earlier, why you replied when you did, why you meant what you said. From your side, it feels considerate. From her side, something else happens. She doesn't think he's so thoughtful. She feels, why does this feel heavy? Because attraction needs breathing room. And explanations, especially unasked ones, crowd the space. When a man is comfortable not explaining himself, it signals something powerful. It signals inner alignment. It says, I'm okay being understood slowly. I don't need to rush you into clarity. I trust who I am. And trust is magnetic. Women are drawn to men who don't over-explain because those men are not performing. They're not trying to control the emotional outcome. They're simply present. Presence is rare, and rarity creates value. This is where most dating advice goes wrong. It teaches men what to say, what to text, how to respond, but it ignores how you feel while saying it. A calm man doesn't explain himself because he doesn't feel the need to defend his reality. His nervous system isn't in panic mode. He's not chasing reassurance. And women don't fall for words. They fall for nervous systems. She's reading your emotional state long before she processes your sentences. That's why a man who says less but feels grounded often has more impact than a man who says everything perfectly. Over-explaining collapses mystery. And mystery isn't about being secretive. It's about allowing space for curiosity. When you explain everything, there's nothing left for her to lean into emotionally. Nothing for her intuition to explore. And attraction thrives on exploration. Think about it this way. Confidence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't justify itself. It doesn't clarify itself endlessly. It simply exists. When you stop over-explaining, you're not being cold, you're being congruent. You're allowing your words and your inner state to match. And that congruence creates a subtle tension, not anxiety but interest. Now here's where it gets deeper. Many men believe that if they don't explain, they'll be misunderstood. That silence will be interpreted as indifference. That boundaries will feel like rejection. But what actually happens is the opposite. When a woman senses that you're okay being misunderstood for a moment, she feels your emotional independence. She feels that you're not outsourcing your self-worth to her approval, and that independence feels safe. Safe doesn't mean boring. Safe means grounded, and grounded men create polarity because they're not trying to extract validation. Over-explaining is often a subtle attempt to control how you're perceived. Not malicious, human, but attraction isn't controlled, it's invited. And invitations require space. There's a difference between being clear and being compulsively clear, between expressing yourself and explaining yourself into exhaustion. Women don't want a man who hides. They want a man who doesn't panic when he's seen imperfectly. That emotional steadiness is what draws them in. In a moment, I'm going to show you how this plays out in real interactions, conversations, texts, even moments of conflict, and why women often feel closer to you when you say less, not more. But first, you need to understand one core psychological truth. Attraction doesn't grow from being understood. It grows from feeling. And when you over-explain, you pull the interaction out of feeling and into analysis. You make it cognitive instead of emotional. Women don't connect through explanations. They connect through presence, tone, timing, and emotional safety. That's why a calm pause can say more than a paragraph. Why a grounded "I hear you" can be more powerful than a detailed justification. And why the man who doesn't rush to explain himself often becomes the man she thinks about later, because he left something unfinished, something alive. There's a specific emotional signal a woman feels when you stop over-explaining, and it's subtle enough that most men never realize it's happening. She feels relieved, not consciously, not in words, but in her body. Because when you don't rush to clarify, justify, or smooth everything out, you remove pressure from the interaction. You're no longer asking her to decide how she feels about you in real time. And that's where attraction quietly deepens. Here's something very few people talk about. When a man over-explains, he unintentionally puts a woman in a position of authority over his emotional state. Every explanation carries an unspoken question. Is this okay? Do you get me now? Did I lose you? She might not hear those words, but she feels them. And the moment she feels responsible for regulating your emotional safety, polarity starts to fade. Not because she doesn't care, but because desire doesn't flow upward toward need. Now imagine the opposite. You say what you mean once. You're honest but not urgent, clear but not defensive. And then you let the moment breathe. That breathing room does something powerful. It allows her emotions to move toward you instead of being managed by you. This is where silence becomes misunderstood. Silence isn't attractive because it's quiet. Silence is attractive when it's stable. There's a difference between silence that feels tense and silence that feels grounded. Tense silence says, I'm holding back. Grounded silence says, I'm at ease. Women feel the difference immediately. A grounded man doesn't fill every gap with words. He trusts the connection enough to let moments land. And when moments land, they linger. Let me give you a real-life example. Imagine you're on a date. She asks a personal question, something about your past, your intentions, your feelings. The over-explaining version of you launches into context. Backstory, disclaimers, clarifications. You talk for 3 minutes straight. You think you're being open. She feels like she's listening to a presentation. Now imagine another version of you. You answer honestly but simply. You pause, you stay present. You don't rush to add more unless she asks. In that pause, something happens. She leans in emotionally. She asks a follow-up. She feels like she's discovering you, not being instructed. Attraction grows in discovery, not disclosure overload. This is why women often say they feel more connected to a man who just gets it, even if he says less. He's not flooding the space. He's holding it. Holding space is one of the most underrated masculine traits. It means you're comfortable with emotional uncertainty. You don't need immediate resolution. You don't need to control how the moment unfolds. And that comfort is deeply attractive. Now let's talk about texting, because this is where over-explaining quietly destroys attraction for a lot of men. Texting removes tone, it removes body language, it removes presence. So when a man feels unsure, he compensates with words. Long messages, multiple follow-ups, explanations for timing, explanations for intent. But here's the paradox. The more you explain over text, the more emotional weight you add to something that should feel light. A confident man doesn't feel the need to narrate his inner state. He lets his consistency speak. If he's interested, he shows it calmly. If he's busy, he doesn't over-justify. If he sets a boundary, he doesn't apologize for it excessively. That emotional economy is what women feel as strength, not dominance, not control, strength. And strength creates safety. This is important. Women are not attracted to men who withhold explanation as a tactic. They're attracted to men who don't need explanation to feel okay. That difference matters. One comes from fear, the other comes from self-trust. When you don't over-explain, you're communicating, I trust my intentions. I trust my behavior. I trust that connection unfolds over time. That trust allows her to relax into her feminine curiosity. She doesn't feel rushed. She doesn't feel pressured to respond a certain way. She doesn't feel emotionally managed. She feels free. And freedom is magnetic. Here's something else most men don't realize. Over-explaining often interrupts emotional tension, the good kind, that slight uncertainty, that wondering, that space where feelings grow. When you immediately explain everything, you resolve tension too early. But attraction needs unresolved space. Not confusion, not anxiety, but anticipation. Think about the moments you remember most in relationships. They weren't perfectly explained. They were felt. A look held a second longer. A pause before a response. A moment where something wasn't said but understood. Men who over-explain rob themselves of those moments, not because they lack value, but because they don't trust silence to carry meaning. Here's the deeper psychological layer. When you stop over-explaining, you're signaling emotional self-sufficiency. You're saying, I don't need constant reassurance to stay grounded. That self-sufficiency activates a woman's desire to invest emotionally. Because now she starts explaining. She starts asking. She starts leaning in, and attraction shifts from being chased to being shared. There's a quiet moment that happens inside a woman when she realizes you're not trying to steer her emotions. It's not dramatic, no sudden realization, no conscious thought like, oh, he's different. It's more like her nervous system exhales. Because most men, without meaning to, try to guide how a woman should feel about them. They explain their intentions early. They reassure too soon. They clarify before confusion even exists. And that constant guidance creates pressure. When you don't over-explain, something rare happens. She feels trusted, not trusted to behave, trusted to feel. You're not telling her how to interpret you. You're allowing her to arrive at her own emotional conclusions. That autonomy is deeply attractive. This is where masculine presence becomes more powerful than masculine effort. Effort tries to earn attraction. Presence allows attraction. And women can feel the difference instantly. Here's a truth that may challenge you. A woman doesn't want to be convinced that you're safe. She wants to feel safe discovering you at her own pace. Over-explaining short-circuits that process. It takes something organic and turns it into a presentation. It turns curiosity into consumption. But when you speak less with intention, you invite her imagination into the connection. And imagination is where desire lives. Let's talk about emotional polarity for a moment. Polarity isn't created by dominance or distance. It's created by grounded contrast. When you're emotionally steady and not reactive, her emotions have space to move, to rise, to soften, to explore. If you over-explain every emotional moment, you flatten that dynamic. You turn a living interaction into a resolved discussion. Women don't fall for resolved discussions. They fall for felt moments. This is why men who are comfortable with emotional ambiguity often feel more attractive, even when they're saying less. They're not afraid of not being perfectly understood right away, and that fearlessness reads as confidence. Now let's go deeper into boundaries, because this is where many men misunderstand silence. A boundary doesn't need a speech. It needs calm enforcement. When a man sets a boundary and then over-explains it, he weakens it, not because the boundary is wrong, but because the explanation reveals hesitation. It says, I need you to agree with this for it to be okay. But a grounded boundary says something else entirely. It says, this is where I stand and I'm okay if you take time to understand it. That calm certainty is profoundly attractive. Women trust men who trust themselves, and self-trust doesn't need justification. Imagine she cancels plans last minute. The over-explaining response sounds like this. You explain how you understand. You explain that you're not upset. You explain your availability. You explain your flexibility. You flood the moment with reassurance. The grounded response sounds simpler, clear, calm, no emotional withdrawal, no punishment, no lecture, just presence. And in that presence, she feels something important. She feels that your emotional world is stable, not contingent on her behavior. That stability is rare, and rarity creates attraction. Here's the part most men miss. When you stop over-explaining, you're not removing care, you're removing anxiety. Care can be felt without being narrated. In fact, the more emotionally intelligent a man becomes, the less he feels the need to explain his intentions, because his behavior already communicates them. Consistency replaces justification. Tone replaces detail. Energy replaces reassurance. Women don't trust words when they're excessive. They trust patterns. Man who doesn't over-explain usually has one thing in common. He's aligned with himself. He knows what he wants. He knows what he offers. He knows where he stands. And that inner alignment allows him to stay relaxed in uncertainty. Let me say this clearly. Uncertainty is not the enemy of attraction. Insecurity is. A man who is at ease with not being fully understood right away feels grounded. A man who panics in uncertainty feels unstable. Women don't pull away from men who are quiet. They pull away from men who are unsettled. Silence becomes dangerous only when it's filled with fear. But when silence comes from self-respect, it feels like depth. This is why women often say things like, I don't know why, but I feel calm around him. He doesn't talk a lot, but I feel seen. He just feels solid. They're not responding to what he explains. They're responding to who he is in the space. Now here's the turning point. When you stop over-explaining, you start listening more. Not just to her words, but to the moment. You respond instead of react. You speak when it adds value, not when it soothes your anxiety. And that shift changes everything. Because now the connection is no longer driven by your need to be understood, it's driven by mutual presence.